Hi. Sorry about that. Thank you, Faye. Faye asked me to speak a little bit about Singleton, but really I've been campaigning for Markwells Wood and to protect the wood and restore the wood. Have any of you taken the train up to London from Havant that goes past Idsworth Church? If any of you have seen that lovely white church on the hill, Markwells Wood is beyond that, on the brow, beyond the brow, and it's just it was a place I'd never been to. It's about 1/4 mile from my house. I didn't even know there was a well site, an old historic well site up in the woodlands there. But I've been driving past Idsworth Church and walking on a circular route around, but I had never seen or even really heard of Markwells Wood in 2014 when Tim Dawes, who was the head of the Green Party in Havant, I don't know if any of you met him, but he was a fearless leader of the Green Party in Havant, and he came to me and asked if I had known anything about that oil well and if I would help him set up a community meeting. So basically I got people I knew to come and he talked to us about fracking. It's 6 years ago and fracking was, Cameron had just announced he was going all out for shale, and the government was set about to incentivize the oil and gas industry in the UK. So what they did was they reduced business rates from 60% to 30%. They reduced taxes. They changed policy. They did everything they could because they saw the US and they saw what fracking was doing for their energy, so-called successful energy independence, and they wanted to bring that over here. But I'm wondering if we can share. Can you guys? I'm going to share my screen so you can see. Can you see that now? This is a map. It shows all the red dots are the wells in the UK. These are onshore wells. There's a lot offshore, but all I'm going to show you is the onshore wells. So that's an overview. On the right, that's the aquifers. On the left, those are the wells. Okay, so he announced he was going. Sorry, Faye, I can't move it forward. Here we go. This is my first time doing PowerPoint or presenting on Zoom, so forgive me, and if you can't hear me, just tell me to speak up or slow down or speed up or shut up.
No, it's all good, Emily. You might just find it slow, that's all. So,
okay.
Yeah.
So this is the success of fracking in the United States. This is the Permian Basin in Texas, and you can see the grid. And the whole thing, and sorry if you know all of this, but the fracking, you can see it's really square or rectangle by rectangle. You can only get oil from the location in which it's drilled. It's not a reservoir of oil that's sitting under the ground that's going to come up flowing easily. And the same in the UK. What we have here, and they've been drilling for years, for decades, but all that easy to get oil is gone. And even the oil in the southeast, for example, around where we are, Horndean, Singleton, Storrington, those are all historic wells, and it didn't just flow. They had to frack it. They had to acid frack, and they had to acidize. They used a lot of chemicals and water to get it out of the ground. So we're not talking, you can see how many wells it takes, back-to-back wells, to get all the oil out of the ground and to achieve some kind of energy independence. And this wouldn't work. If you look at this would not work in the UK because it's impossible. We don't have the infrastructure. We don't have we have small country lanes. It's just horrific what they've done to America, and this is just disgusting. Anyway, it's kind of a joke when to a lot of people I talk to about fracking, they didn't really believe it was going to happen. And some people think it was just a ploy to get investment. But they did go ahead and they tried to do it up north. And they're trying to do it in the southeast, but it's a different strata. The Weald is a different rock. So what they won't do is high volume hydraulic fracturing. What they will do is fracking. Now, one of the major things that the government did was to change the statutory definition of what it means to frack. So I don't think there was a definition, an official definition, until 2015. They changed the Infrastructure Act. And they said that fracking meant that the company had to use 10,000 cubic meters of water for each stage of fracking in order to be called or defined fracking. Anything below that wouldn't be called fracking. And that is important because if you were fracking, there were certain protections. They had setback rules from housing. They had, you couldn't drill within a certain distance from the aquifer. There were some protections, not enough protections, but there were some protections for fracking. But if you were not so-called non-fracking, we had nothing, very little. And there was very little knowledge. So that was one of the main things, was the change in definition. So we started out in 2014 as frack-free Markwells Wood, but we soon found out we were not fracking, so we became Markwells Wood Watch. And we set about to learn about acidizing and acid fracking and what they had done historically in the Southeast, and then to get some idea of what they might do in the future. Here's a little map that actually Ann Stewart created, and you can see where the wells are in the Southeast. This is Horndean. Do any of you know where that well is? Do you know where the Morrisons is on the roundabout heading north? It's hidden away, you can't see it. Singleton, is Philip on tonight? I don't think he is, but he lives right there near Singleton. Lidsey, I could see the drill rig from the train when it was drilled a couple of years ago. It was horrific. And the Isle of Wight, and of course, Wych Farm is one of the biggest. So Wych Farm is one of the biggest, Singleton is the second largest, and so on. So when I knew nothing about oil and gas, and I was kind of thrown into the deep end, as were all of us, I think. What we did was we waited to see. We'd heard that in 2015, UK Oil and Gas bought the rights to, not the rights, but the license to drill. And so we waited for an application, and that came in 2016. And the application was complicated, and so we divided into groups. And Stuart did the ecological aspect, and I took care of the hydrogeology and the geology, the seismic aspect. And there's so many different elements: traffic, sound, pollution, air pollution, water pollution. So we had a lot of work to do. I think for 7 months, I worked 15 hours a day, just kind of researching and campaigning, trying to drum up people to object. And it's complicated. I don't even think the planners really understand everything that's going on. So, and if you're campaigning against something, you have to learn more. You have to learn a lot so that you can argue against people who were fighting for it. So there was a huge learning curve. We were really lucky, though, in one aspect, is that we learned that our catchment, our water catchment area, and that's the Portsmouth water catchment area, is extremely vulnerable. And have any of you walked around here and seen all the sinkholes? so I can't really see you guys whether yes or no, but there's a sinkhole, about 1,500 sinkholes in the area or more. And when I moved here, I thought there are no rivers and there's all these holes in the ground. And my husband said, oh, that we didn't know there were 1,500, but he said that there were left over from the Germans who were dropping bombs on the way back from London, which seemed kind of crazy. The more I looked, the more I saw these holes. And the holes are representative of the karstic setting. And I don't want to get too complicated. I'll show you a slide, and I have to slip down a little bit. Just let me go back. That's Markwells Wood, and that's the historic drill rig. That was 2010. I'll talk about the karstic and the hydrogeology in a little bit. So I'm going to backtrack. So that's when it was explored in 2010, before I moved to the area. And that's what it looked like from the road near our house. It was huge and invasive. Not our house, because it wasn't our house then, but this is a neighbor's picture. The company drilled the well, and they explored, and they went 1,500 meters down into the earth. They came upon a massive seismic fault, and a fault line, and so they had to slant it to the side to avoid that. And then they explored for oil. They acidized it. They put a lot of chemicals, and I think they fracked it, which used to mean just exceeding a certain pressure of the rock to release the oil. Then they didn't get much oil, and they closed up, and they said it wasn't economic, and then they left. And then 2015, this other company, UKOG, apparently bought it for £1, but in fact the company before just changed the name and sold it to itself. So we were a little suspicious. What are they after? Maybe they're going to just frack more, use more chemicals, more pressure, and get more oil out. That was the big question. So we looked towards Horndean to see what they were doing there, and indeed we found out that they had fracked to get the oil out. and we had a lot of questions because it was acidizing, and there was no regulations around that. I did a little research. I went to California legislation where they also do acidize, and I saw all the regulations there, and I took the questions and the regulations and turn them around and use them as questions to our environment agency to find out what they knew about what was going on beneath the ground. And what we learned, and we had a meeting with the EA, is that there was absolutely no permitting in onshore oil and gas until 2013. So they knew nothing about what was going on under the ground. They didn't require a list of chemicals. They didn't require any kind of research on the wastewater coming out of the ground. They didn't require special cleaning of the wastewater or dumping of the wastewater. There was just nothing. They knew nothing. There's nothing on the emissions, on the VOCs. Very, very, very little. And it was absolutely shocking. And so when they were pushing forward fracking in the UK and saying we have gold standard regulations, and you can see the debates in the House of Lords and Parliament, and saying how Americans were cowboys and they didn't know what they were talking about. And in the same time, 2013, 14, 15, the regulations were abhorrent. So they were lying to us, and we're not protected, and we still are not protected. So 2013, they did start changing. Regulation 60 came in, and they started re-permitting. There weren't many permits, but they started requiring sites to start going through and doing more intense hydrogeology testing to make sure that they were a little bit better. And they do have to permit there have been changes, but of course the EA was also stripped of funding, so 40% down, and it's still pretty much self-regulated. Industry isn't called, and it costs less probably to pay the fine than it does to actually change their practices. So we discovered a lot of crazy things that I was surprised by that. I would have expected more. So that was how the site was left. This is what it looked like after it was abandoned in 2011. And that's the ancient woodland. So what we were fighting for was the restoration of this site, and to turn down the application for further drilling and to restore the site, which was ancient woodland. So it's a forested ancient woodland. The trees are harvested. This is right next to the site. The trees are harvested, but it's all about the soil. So what had happened in 2010 is that they had pushed all the ancient woodland soil to the side, covered the area with tarmac, and dug that 1,500-meter well. And they used some of the farm field for the trucks.
Emily, Liz has just asked if it's part of the Havant Thicket.
What's happened to Havant Thicket?
Is that part of Havant Thicket? But
oh no, that is on the other side of Rowlands Castle. It's probably 3 miles away. But yeah, that's similar ancient woodland. That it's similar, but it's not connected. So Anne Stewart, who's not with us tonight, was doing the research, and that's a Bechstein's bat, which is she discovered was in the area. That's a very rare bat, and there were 13 species of bats that were discovered in the area. We got in touch. She got in touch with the RSPB person who documented a lot of birds, protected birds from the red list. And we reached out to all sorts of NGOs, the Anglers Association, the CPRE did a lot of work with us. Friends of the Earth were fantastic. They really helped us. You were saying that you needed people to help with press releases. We had media training and all sorts of things, and really, really incredible mentorship there with Friends of the Earth. So that was really helpful, because they do that wonderful campaigning. The only thing is that none of the Tory people wanted anything to do with us if we were associated with Friends of the Earth. So you probably find a similar thing with XR. Sometimes they just won't talk to you. And so we just were Markwells Wood Watch, which sounded pretty benign. It's a very, very conservative area here. It was tricky lobbying, but we did it. Used mostly a lot of very, very straightforward science, and it was protecting the water became our main concern. So and the environment and restoring the wood. And also one thing that we had, another big thing, was that the area was designated national park. So when it was given permission to drill originally, it wasn't national park, and then it became South Downs National Park. But that's another thing. If it was called fracking, it wouldn't be even considered in the national park. But because it was non-fracking, there's the possibility. So we had to do a lot of arguments in terms of public amenity and the view from the bridle path and all these things that had nothing to do with chemicals and pollution, unfortunately. This was the plan that we found. The company went and said that it was just for one well and possibly one sidetrack, but we knew that they tell the investors different things, and they had a whole plan for 15 wells and a 40-year plan. So that was also kind of shocking. And then we found out where these wells were, and we went to all the people who lived above the wells to find out whether they liked that idea. And for those who were kind of for fracking or didn't even care if you told them their property value might go down 20%. That was concerning to some people. This is a close-up of the oolite, which was the target foundation. So the oil is really trapped in that rock. It doesn't flow, and it's cemented as well in kind of a dolomite, very, very, very hard rock with low permeability. And that's the whole thing about when you saw all the wells in the Permian Basin, that's shale, which is even harder, but this is a limestone, so it's softer, but it still takes an awful lot of chemicals to release the oil. And what it does is it dissolves the rock and then releases. So what we found out is that acidizing can use up to 18% chemicals, whereas fracking would use 0.5 and a lot of pressure. So there's a much bigger chemical load in acidizing, and they can acidize over and over again in the lifetime of the well. So they put the chemicals down and they dissolve the rock and they slowly get the oil out. So, and because no data has been collected, they have no idea on the impact on the environment. They don't have any studies. There are very few studies. They're getting a few more now. And because it wasn't defined, there were a lot of studies after the fracking, about fracking, but it didn't involve acidizing. So we didn't have very many health studies or environmental studies. Basically, there was so little protection. We tried to argue that there's no way they could say it was safe. And one of the big problems with the oil companies, they came in and they showed that there were no hazards. They put low risk to almost everything, including the water. So it was so obviously poorly managed, and so they didn't provide any mitigation. And that's essentially what led to their downfall. This is a little graph of acidizing, not fracking. The whole thing with acidizing and fracking became a nightmare because up north they were fracking and anti-fracking and all the nannies, and we wanted to be with them and be anti-fracking, and fracking such a good word, but we couldn't campaign using the word fracking because they were not fracking, even though they were. So it was a real semantic debate. So you can see here, acid cleaning is used in fracking. You clean out the borehole, and then acid stimulation is a little bit more, and then acid and hydraulic fracturing is when they use the chemicals and a lot of pressure and water to crack open the rock. So depending on the rock formation, it really makes a difference. Sandstone and limestone, as I said, would be acidized and acid fracked, and then the shale would be high hydraulic fracturing. This is
you're just about to move on to the aquifer, but yeah, one of the questions is whether the chemicals go into the aquifer, but it looks like you're about to move on to that.
Yeah, chemicals, that's one of the biggest questions, and there's been no studies on the pathways from the wellhole to the aquifer. There have been not at that, well, when I say no studies, a lot of this work was done in 2017. So since then, I haven't really heard, but certainly not with acidizing. But this is the valley, this is the Itzworth Valley that we were talking about, and you might have noticed that there are no rivers except for in the winter when the aquifers recharge and the water rises up, and then we have these beautiful rivers that appear over the roads and cause flooding and whatnot. So this is what's going on below the ground, and that's our karstic aquifer. The carbon in the rain, when it falls around Markwells Wood, goes through the ground and percolates through, and then creates the chalk, which is cracked. The carbon eats away bigger holes, and then the water flows to the aquifer. And the reason why this was so important to us is that the flow is extremely fast. And if the rainwater will go, they did some flow tests in the sinkholes, 10 hours. They dropped tinted liquid down, tinted water, and it took 10 hours to get to the source. So if you had an oil spill, a chemical spill, there's no way that you could remediate. So we learned that the source protection zoning for our water supplies all over England are wrongly delineated because they don't take into consideration this kind of environment, the karst. And the karst is all across the southeast and up in the north and some in Kent. So it's a large swathes of our water is falling under wrong categories of protection. So what we learned by hiring a hydrogeologist, independent hydrogeologist, is that our area is extremely vulnerable and probably is source protection zone 1. It goes, is this too much information? We divide into source protection zone 1, 2, and 3. And because they don't really know, they hadn't really done enough studies, and because it's very difficult to classify the karst, that was really in our favor, because the oil company said we were in a zone 2, which would mean 400 days to get from the point to the source, when in reality it could have been 10 hours. Mm-hmm. So the difference, it was astonishing. So that's our community group.
I was just going to ask Emily, or Philip might just want to ask actually, because you just said who's they, or did tinted water test? Oh, who did the tinted water?
Oh, the tinted water test. Yeah, that was in the 70s. They did that. Portsmouth Water. Yeah. That's really another category, though, the delineation of the protection zones. I know, hi Philip, we've been talking about Singleton, and Philip's been doing some work there, trying to find out about how that zone, I think Singleton Well is in source protection zone 3, but it might be 2. So you can argue, if you find these loopholes, you can argue them and at least raise doubt. And if you raise doubt, then there's a question mark, and people might consider these sites a little bit more and realize that it's not so cut and dry. So that's, when you were talking about photo ops, really good. We would get all our group together and we'd create a photograph and then put in the newspaper, and the Portsmouth newspaper and Chichester newspaper and Petersfield Post, and do what we could. None of us were good on Instagram. It just never happened. But every once in a while we got people together. We liked doing positive things like Valentine's Day for the love of Markwells Wood. That was really nice, and it got the kids out rather than just being negative, and it was important to do a few positive things as well. And just to move on, I'll go back. Markwells Wood was a success. The oil company withdrew the application in the day before it was to be heard. The officer recommended refusal. The Environment Agency had opposed it. The water company opposed it. The Highways Department opposed it, and we had over 1,000 people writing in, and that's one thing that you guys can all do, and you guys have done so much. Extinction Rebellion's done a lot to raise awareness about the climate, and also the lock-ons at Horse Hill, but also writing objections is really important. On Monday, there was the Broadford Bridge application was heard by West Sussex County Council, and they approved it 11-1 or 10-1 for another 2 years of exploring up there. So that was really disappointing. and hearing the arguments, the debate, it was very clear that they didn't really know what they were talking about. So again, it's just so tricky. But we would normally have had a little demonstration outside, right? And I know that you guys have done a lot in Chichester, so it really does help, because you can get the photograph and you can get the word out, and they know that we're watching, right? So Broadford Bridge, this was protest at the gate, and so we're going to see more action there, because we've got a few more years of protest there. This is Brockham and Surrey. We have good news from Loxley, Dunsfold, which is near Guildford. The Surrey County Council refused permission last week, so that for the same UK oil and gas company. So that's something to celebrate. That was really exciting. And yeah, we have also the Isle of Wight. So UK oil and gas, who tried Markwells Wood, tried is at Broadford Bridge, Horse Hill, and now they want to go to the Isle of Wight. So I have a link at the end. If people could write objections to the Isle of Wight, that ends on the 24th of July. That would be really helpful. And just one last thing that I wanted to talk about was the Singleton, the methane project that I was involved in. We had a woman from Texas named Sharon Wilson. You can see her face reflected in her camera. She has this really incredible imagery camera that reads the infrared, reads the pollution, it can see what we can't see. If you can see the picture on her camera, she sees the pollution, and what we're seeing is just the air, if you can see above. And Faye, you were going to show, I'm going to show you, because other than the pollution that's obvious in the chemicals that go in the ground, we've got all the emissions coming out and the methane. And that's something that is pretty astounding. So I'm going to show you some of the work that we did. This one is not an oil site, but it's Centrica Energy power station. So what it does is it'll show you what we don't see are the VOCs, sorry, that is the methane that we cannot see with our naked eye. So that's what you would see on a regular day, on a sunny day. And then when you put the camera on, that's what's going on. What you don't see, what we write about, and why we're protecting the air quality. It's pretty shocking. And I don't know, Faye, if you can can you move to the single?
Yeah, did you want me to, I'll have to share my screen. Where was it? It was there, wasn't it?
Yes.
So if you stop sharing, and then I think I can.
Okay.
You see that?
Yes.
You see that, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, we went all over the country filming different sites, and this was in Singleton. Thanks to Philip for pointing it out. Again, this was a drive-by. This was our first one, and she was really nervous because in America you can't trespass. So we were trespassing, but you can't get arrested in this country for that. So it's a drive-by shooting. You can see the constant emissions, and Philip will attest to the fact that it's going on and on, isn't it, Philip? Is it currently like this?
It was when I went up there the other day, and you notice there's two burners there, and they're huge, and belching black smoke, so you can see it, and you can see the flames licking their way up through the smoke as well.
So you've got a flare there, so you'll see the flames. They're flaring off the gas and converting the methane to CO2. So it's a little better than just cold venting, which is happening all over the countryside, where it's just methane spewing out.
The black smoke that you could see.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that pretty much, I think that wraps it up. I just wanted to say thank you for all that you guys have done to raise awareness. I mean, more than anything, all the actions are so great and inspiring, and you're only 10 miles away, and I never get to come to anything. But I'm keeping an eye. I see what you've been doing, and it's fantastic.